Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about clauses and phrases. By the time we're done today, you should be able to describe the difference between a clause and a phrase. And additionally, and this is the important piece, you should be able to identify the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. So let's go ahead and get into it. First off, you need to know that a clause is a group of words with a subject and verb, and a phrase is just a group of words without a subject and a verb. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see kind of a ranking order of how we put words together in English. At the very basic level, we have words, so each individual word, but then when we start grouping words together, we get phrases. And a group of words together without a subject and a verb is a phrase. Now, the next level up, though, is once we've added in a subject and a verb, so an action that's taking place and someone or something doing that action, then we have a clause. The only difference between a clause and a phrase is that there's a subject and verb inside of a clause and there isn't inside of a phrase. Above clauses, you'll see that we have sentences. So we use clauses to create sentences. And later on, we're going to talk about how different clauses work together to create different types of sentences. And then above sentences, we have paragraphs. When we group a bunch of sentences together, we get an idea, we get a paragraph. And that's kind of our highest level here. Now, like I mentioned before, the important thing today is that you can differentiate between an independent clause and a dependent clause. And the reason why that matters so much is because being able to differentiate between an independent and a dependent clause will allow you to punctuate correctly once you begin using different sentence types, which you probably already are. And so we want to make sure that we put commas in the right places and semicolons in the right places. And the only way to figure that out is to be able to interpret the difference between what is dependent and what is independent. So let's look at it. An independent clause is a complete thought. It is a clause that can be a sentence on its own. It has a subject, it has a verb, it makes self by itself. A dependent clause, though, is an incomplete thought. It's a clause that can't be a sentence on its own. So it's still a clause, it still has a subject and a verb, it has those pieces, but it doesn't quite make sense independently. It depends on other information. And because it depends on other information, we call it a dependent clause. So again, we have independent clauses, we have dependent clauses. Independent clauses can stand on their own, dependent clauses cannot. Let's look at a couple of examples. So, example 1 on the left, the man went to the store to buy bread and milk. That is an independent clause. That makes sense on its own. On the right, we have, although he went to the store. That's a dependent clause. It does not make sense on its own. So if we look at these more carefully, with our independent clause, you can see that we have our subject underlined, the man, our verb underlined, went, and then that whole thing makes sense. We could just put a period at the end and it would work as a sentence. The man went to the store to buy bread and milk. Period, done. That makes sense on its own. That's an independent clause. Our dependent clause, on the other hand, though, does not make sense on its own. So again, we still have a subject, he, and we still have a verb, went, but it doesn't work independently. If I read this to you, you're going to see what I mean. Although he went to the store. And because that doesn't quite work, because you want a little bit more information in order for that sentence to make sense, because that clause depends on more information, it's called a dependent clause. Now, again, the only difference that we're looking at here, is independent clauses make sense independently. They work on their own. Dependent clauses do not. That's going to be really important as we start putting sentences together. Thank you so much for watching today.